welcome to Dignified Resilience. Did you know that by the end of 2019, the number of people forcibly displaced for various reasons, war, conflict, persecution, human rights violations, had grown to 79.5 million, which is the highest number on record according to available data? Well, that's the reality that we're going to be talking about in today's episode. On June 18, 2 days before World Refugees Day, UNHCR published a global trends report which showed that forced displacement is now affecting more than 1% of humanity, meaning 1 in every 97 people, and confirmed that fewer and fewer of those who flee are able to go home and to return. So in this episode, I'm joined by two experts, Marta Guerrero Ble&Rachel Schmidtke from Refugees International, an organization that advocates for life-saving assistance and protection for displaced people and promotes solutions to displacement crises. And one thing that I read that they pride themselves in is that they do not accept any government or UN funding, ensuring the independence and credibility of their work. I'd like to also introduce them in more detail. Marta Guerrero Ble focuses on expanding labor market access to refugees. She's a graduate of Georgetown Masters of Science in Foreign Service, where she focused on the intersection of development and humanitarian issues. During her studies, Marta interned at the International Organization for Migration in Myanmar, where she worked in labor displacement and skills development programs. Prior to Georgetown, Marta focused on leveraging the private sector towards development outcomes. She worked with female-led startups in Mexico City, helping them to kickstart their businesses. Originally from Tampico, Mexico, Marta received her bachelor's in international business from Tec de Monterrey. And Rachel Schmidtke, she is the advocate for Latin America at Refugees International, because we will speak specifically about that region a little bit in today's episode. Previously, Rachel played a key role in the development of the Mexico Institute's migration portfolio and Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She produced policy work on Mexico, Central America, and US migration, asylum, and refugee policies. And she previously worked as part of the World Bank Gender Group, as well as the UN World Food Program in Lima, Peru, and USAID in San Salvador in El Salvador. Returned Peace Corps Peru volunteer, Rachel received her MA in International Development Policy from Duke University, focusing on migration, Latin American foreign policy, and gender. I'm joined by two great experts. I'm so excited for today's conversation. First of all, how are you today, Marta?
I'm very excited, first of all, to be here because we're going to be definitely discussing a topic that is of extreme importance today, especially with COVID, the pandemic, everything. So discussing the needs of refugees is definitely, I'm very proud to have this opportunity and raise this important topic here with you, Riada.
Thank you. Rachel, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having both of us. I know Marta and I are very excited to talk about this topic that we're both very passionate about. I think, trying to maintain the motivation and keep, pushing forward during this time. It's been a very challenging time for refugees in particular. So, really hoping that we can keep bringing those voices forth in our work.
Absolutely. Well, first, before we dive in, I do want to just shortly paint some big picture for our listeners at the beginning. We have 5 countries that today account for 2/3 of people displaced across borders: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And at the end of 2019, the largest forcibly displaced population worldwide, of course, were by far Syrians, with 13.2 million, including those 6.6 million refugees and more than 6 million who are internally displaced people. And I do want to, of course, mention that when considering those internationally displaced situations, Syrians also topped the list with 6.7 million persons, followed by Venezuela's at 4.5 million. Afghanistan and South Sudan had 3.0 and 2.2 million respectively, and then Myanmar with 1.1 million. So Martha, on March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization actually officially declared the situation a pandemic. And then on March 30th, your organization already published a report that the pandemic international response must be inclusive of refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. As expected, of course, now we do see a few months later that as the pandemic spreads, the coronavirus disproportionately impacted or impacts these groups and the world's most vulnerable, among them refugees and asylum seekers and IDPs. So, as written in your report, already their displacement leaves them disadvantaged in many ways. But can you elaborate a bit more for our listeners about how these factors affect more specifically refugees in terms of the pandemic and everything that's changed additionally to their already present vulnerabilities before it?
Yeah, and thank you so much. And we are, what we're seeing is that even before the pandemic, refugees lacked access to a lot of rights, including the right to work, the right to be included sometimes in the health systems of the host countries. Obviously, this varies from a country to country basis, but generally speaking, in low and middle income countries where most refugees are hosted, there's a widespread lack of access to these rights. And this lack of access to rights has led to refugees to be disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And what we are seeing is a widespread loss of livelihood for many refugee families, as well as the possibility for them to have the virus without the possibility to access health services. And what we are seeing right now with refugees and refugee families is that there's mass evictions of individuals, especially urban refugees that have to cover their rent, or the food insecurity is increasing as well because they're not able to afford their basic needs. We have to also consider that the delivery of services and aid by humanitarian organizations has also been reduced as a result of the lockdowns. So this pandemic has definitely put the world at in a big problem, because we don't really know anymore how to respond to what is happening, and refugees are paying the price.
Right. So, Rachel, how are these and other issues playing out across this major humanitarian and displacement crises? What are these, at least, key principles and recommendations that should be part of any effective response to the pandemic? Or rather, if each humanitarian crisis will require a specific strategy, can we talk, what are the commonalities that maybe we can talk about?
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated question. I think, this is obviously an unprecedented time, and it is a very fluid time where things are changing very quickly. But I think some core things that we have to keep in mind when framing policy responses to the pandemic is that governments really need to include refugees in their responses. We found in certain countries, Venezuelan refugees and migrants are saying that they don't feel included in the government response. So that's something that has to really be considered, because if you're leaving refugees out of the equation, they're already some of the most vulnerable oftentimes in society. And so by leaving them out, it further pushes them into vulnerability, which causes lasting long-term effects. So really the government response is one of the main challenges that we find that is one of the best solutions really to the problem, but it is a challenge as well. I think the other thing to take into account is humanitarian response at this time. I think particularly looking at the Venezuela situation, this crisis has been going on for about 5 years now. It's heading into what we call like protracted territory, meaning that it's no longer just happening very short term. It is a long-term crisis. And so the strategies around how we respond to that have changed over time, where we're looking more at things like longer term integration measures, like Marta mentioned, access to work, access to healthcare, affordable housing, these things that really help a refugee or a migrant integrate well into society. But what the pandemic is doing is essentially throwing all that kind of out the window. What we're really having to worry about now is the urgent humanitarian response. So you have, as Marta mentioned, mass evictions, food insecurity, really lack of any sort of type of livelihood or resiliency mechanisms. And so that's pushing all the progress that we made back 3 or 4 years in many of these countries. So I think focusing as well on not only the longer term integration, but really now on the urgent humanitarian need is something that we have to focus on in in our response. And I think the final thing, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit later, is really taking into account the needs of women and girls and members of the LGBTQ community. I mean, there's certain sectors that we know in refugee populations that are often face disproportionate difficulties and challenges during the pandemic. So we have to start bringing in a bit more of a gendered response to what's going on as well. So those are a few things that we can work on, but it's obviously changing day to day. So
absolutely, and I definitely do want to address various things that you mentioned, and specifically integration of the refugees that I want to talk about with Martha. In terms of the host countries, if we speak about it, okay, we know that Turkey hosted the largest number of refugees worldwide with 3.6 million people, then Colombia second with 1.8 million, including Venezuelans displaced abroad, then Pakistan 1.4 million, Uganda 1.4, and Germany 1.1 million. But these numbers, which keep rising, are not also easy automatically on the host countries as well. So Martha is the right person to ask, because she leads the Let Them Work initiative at Refugees International, which from what I gather is a joint program with the Center for Global Development, which seeks to expand labor market access for refugees worldwide. So can you please tell us more about this partnership, and what should we be thinking about in terms of both the programming and what kind of financing, or what are the recommendations in terms of the scope of the work within the Let Them Work initiative that you are in charge of?
Yeah, and well, I just want to highlight the fact that refugees are commonly perceived or referred to as a burden by host countries. So normally where like refugee hosting countries refer to hosting refugees as a burden that needs to be assuaged, or that they need the support by donors and others to cover that burden. But with the Let Them Work initiative, we really want to create consciousness that refugees are not necessarily a burden, but they're also economic contributors to their host communities, and that they consume food, they pay taxes, especially on the items they consume, they work, they increase the productivities of the companies where or the businesses where they work. And overall, they are active participants of their host communities as workers, or just neighbors, and people in general. And yes, they do sometimes pose a burden in terms of increased expenses on fiscal and institution expenses for the host countries. But in general, we have to consider that those expenses are often also counteracted by the benefits that refugees bring. And basically the Let Them Work initiative focus on that, like understanding how we can create these shared benefits for refugees and host communities through expanding their access to labor and their inclusion into the economy of their host countries. Understanding that they're not necessarily a burden, but when they're given the chance, they can contribute actively and bring many benefits, from fiscal benefits, from higher productivity to their host countries, to GDP and economic growth. And this is something that we are already seeing at some scale in countries like Colombia and Peru, where Venezuelans are already boosting economic growth in these nations, at least before the pandemic. Now we're yet to see how's playing with the economic shocks of COVID, but in general, they do build more resilient economies because they are active economic contributors. So basically the Let Them Work initiative, we are trying to understand what are the barriers that prevent refugees from accessing these employment opportunities and integrating into the economy and being active participants, and generating evidence that shows host countries how to create these shared benefits and a win-win for host communities and refugees themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely very important. And I think that we see now slowly that in countries like Colombia, you mentioned, and then Ethiopia, Jordan, and Turkey, refugees and forced migrants are slowly gaining the formal right and opportunity to kind of be included within the host country's economy. And then many of them still are not allowed to work. And World Bank just recently published a report that reviews the obstacles as well that refugees and IDPs face when integrating in the labor market. And so I wanted to ask you, Marta, what is the role of the private sector here? I know I've read some examples from Turkey, for example, with Syrian refugees and their work in the garment factories, and how a lot of them were at first employed informally without any protections, and how slowly they've gained this official right to work. But can you tell us what's the role of the private sector here as well?
It's very important, because mobilizing the private sector not only to participate as well into hiring refugees, and mobilizing them to be advocates to show that refugees can be good employees, and that refugees have the capabilities to perform jobs. We sometimes see refugee doctors, engineers, and very highly skilled individuals working in low-skilled jobs that do not really match their skill set. So by the private sector having them hire refugees and share the experiences of good experiences in hiring refugees, because there's a common perception that refugees, for some reason, are not skilled enough, or because they were educated in another country, they don't have the capability to perform the job. But that's a misconception, and having the experiences shared by the private sector is very important. But to achieve this, we also need the support of international actors. So it's really a collaborative space to allow the private sector and to promote private sector participation as advocates and as employers as well for refugee communities.
And kind of in line of what you said, World Refugee Day is just behind us, and I've seen many organizations from UNHCR to many other ones, NGOs as well, we're spotlighting precisely that role that refugees are playing now as essential workers as well in the fight against COVID-19 in many countries, and how refugees make these societies in their host countries more stronger and resilient as well, as you said. So considering today, just an hour ago or so, I read it. Are we allowed to speak about lockdown and left behind, Martha? So,
yes, I'll be so excited.
Absolutely.
To share the findings. Yeah.
So this is, you can tell us more about it. It's the new report that's been published today about the economic effects of COVID-19 on refugees and economic inclusion. So give us the news.
So yeah, I'm very excited to share that we just a couple of hours ago published our report analyzing the economic impact of COVID on refugees. It's titled Lockdown and Left Behind. It's a report that we co-authored with the Center for Global Development and the International Rescue Committee. And basically what we find is, what are the effects? Like we set ourselves to ask, like, what are the effects of COVID on refugees' livelihoods, on refugees' incomes, especially if we already knew that they were kind of vulnerable and their economic integration was already not so good before COVID. So basically what we found is that the lack of economic inclusion for refugees in host countries, especially in low and middle income countries, has pushed them to work in very specific types of jobs that are not only informal, but are also concentrated in hard-hit sectors as a result of the pandemic. So we found that 60% of refugees are concentrated in hard-hit sectors, which is way more than the host population. And this means that as a result of this concentration and the job insecurity, refugees are more likely to lose their jobs resulting from the lockdowns and the COVID-19. But not only losing their jobs and their livelihoods, but also like their ability to join the labor market will be also affected, because they technically, in many countries, they don't have this right to actually work formally or work according to their skills. So the pre-existing barriers for them to join the labor market will also affect their income. Plus, the effects of COVID on the delivery of humanitarian aid will also affect their income. And then the effects of COVID on the fact that they're not included in the host country response and the social safety nets So basically, we're leaving refugees with no option to kind of like survive. So this puts them in a really precarious place where they cannot really take a day off of work, and they can take exploitative work or work in abusive conditions, and just increase the risk of actually having COVID. So yeah, it's just really like the lack of economic inclusion previous to COVID is having tremendous effects now with the pandemic.
Wow, and I think that it's very important to note, and it's quite impressive that this paper represents the largest quantitative cross-country comparison of refugees, 10.64 million from what I read, or 30% of all refugees worldwide, which means that it represents the situation as it is from a really big sample, making it quite veritable and important. So we'll come back to Martha, but there are many questions now. Rachel, tell us what's going on in Latin America. I mean, we now know that the president of Brazil has tested positive. A couple of weeks ago, I think president of Honduras as well was hospitalized. What is going on in Latin America?
So yeah, Latin America is a very difficult time right now. I would say that it's really hitting at the peak of the virus, and it really has become the global epicenter. Apart from the United States, Latin America is the epicenter of the pandemic. So the region has about 8% of the world's population, but accounts for over half of cases now. So you can see how it's disproportionately affecting the Latin America region. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that the response to the pandemic varies country by country. And so some countries have really been very strict and enforced lockdowns quickly. Other countries did not. But unfortunately, even the countries that have enforced lockdowns are still facing very high rates of infection. And really what it comes down to in the region is that it's a highly unequal region. And so you find that the people who have access to less health services, who work in informal jobs, et cetera, really are bearing the brunt of the pandemic. And so we really are in uncharted territory, as I mentioned earlier, and Latin America, unfortunately, still has a long way to go before the pandemic starts to ease up a little bit. And I think economically, the repercussions will be devastating.
Oh yeah, that's a very important question, and I both of you can chip in answering my precisely next question. Is that we know that the global humanitarian response for COVID-19 is massively underfunded, and as it is increasing financial and social pressures on Latin American institutions as well, and we see that the projections for economic growth in all countries keeps getting lower and lower. What are governments doing, or what should they do in terms of spending these resources wisely? So both of you can chip in.
So basically, right now, it's important to, first of all, include refugees within the planning and response. Host countries might be tempted to leave refugees out of the response, but this is only going to make the situation worse. First of all, by putting refugees in a situation where COVID can spread, so not necessarily making an effective lowering the curve, how they say it, like reducing the rate of spread of COVID. And second of all, just generating further inequality, further suffering, especially for this very specific population that they have committed to protect. They're committed to protect. So that's from the get-go. But second of all, especially now with the economic crisis and with the dire economic projections, especially in Latin America, it's important that we consider the important role that international financial institutions play in supporting host refugees countries in their response. And right now, we are seeing a wide mobilization of resources from the World Bank, from the IMF, and from regional banks to support countries with by providing loans, by providing grants, and providing resources for them to be able to mobilize their economy and strengthen their institutions and just have a cushion during the economic slowdown. But it is important that these international institutions do not forget to include refugees while they are providing these financing facilities. And, you know, the World Bank has some financing facilities that are specific for refugee hosting countries. Particularly, I'm thinking of the IDA 19 refugee sub-window, which I believe right now provides $2.2 billion in grants for low-income refugee hosting countries. And then there is also the Global Concessional Financing Facility for middle-income refugee hosting countries that has around $3 billion in funding from banks and donors. And I think it's not only important that within the COVID financing facilities, refugees are included, but also that refugee hosting countries can leverage other financing facilities that are provided due to the fact that they're hosting refugees to invest in their economies, to strengthen their response, and most importantly, to include refugees in that response.
I mean, you mentioned refugees, and the first thing that comes to my mind, Latin America, of course, is Venezuelans, right? We have 4.5 million Venezuelans who had left the country by the end of 2019, traveling mainly to other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I was struck to learn that, you know, the number of displaced Venezuelans is set to hit 7 million by the end of this year. So can you tell us a little bit about which regional countries host the most Venezuelans? And from what I read, they keep being left out of the response. So you also wrote a report how the COVID-19, Rachel, a pandemic is decimating the Colombian economy and exacerbating what was already a challenging humanitarian situation, as you said. So can you tell us a little bit more, please?
Sure. So yeah, the Venezuela crisis, the majority of Venezuelan hosting countries are in the region. The top ones would be Colombia, who hosts 1.8 million Venezuelans. Peru hosts nearly 1 million, close to 900,000. Chile, about 500,000. Ecuador, close to 400,000. And Brazil around that much as well. And so really we have a high concentration of Venezuelans in a few countries in the region. And the report I wrote in Colombia is really showing that the lack of regularization, meaning that Venezuelans who do not have access to legal status, so they're working kind of under the table, flying under the radar, essentially because of the policies that have been implemented regionally. Really, this is not just a Colombia issue, but is occurring in Peru, Ecuador, Chile as well, and even Caribbean nations like Trinidad and Tobago. That lack of status has really had a very negative effect on refugees, particularly because it forces them into what Martha mentioned, which is the informal work, meaning that they don't have a formal job contract. They're working as street vendors or as domestic workers, or jobs that don't provide a lot of protection for people. And the other thing is that if something happens to them, let's say they get hurt on the job or sick on the job, there's not that sort of social safety net for them to be able to take off of work or access healthcare. And there's also the fear of being deported. So you have this sort of very complex mix of factors that are essentially forcing many refugees in the region to not be able to access the healthcare and the work that would help them be resilient in the face of the COVID pandemic. And on top of that, you have countries that are lower middle income countries that also have populations that are citizens that are also suffering enormously. In Colombia, we have like a situation of crises colliding where you have people that are poor Colombians that are also struggling to find work and survive during the pandemic. You have, Colombia has one of the highest number of internally displaced people in the world. So you have the IDP population as well that is also suffering. And then you have groups like indigenous groups that also are historically marginalized and aren't given much attention paid to by the government or even international organizations. So you've got 4 or 5 different crises operating at the same time, and everyone needs help and everyone needs resources. And so unfortunately, many governments are saying, well, I want to prioritize my own citizens. And as Marta rightly pointed out, refugees and migrants really are an economic bonus, but I think in the way we phrase that can be challenging, especially in a region that has historically not had refugees in the past. I mean, this Venezuela crisis, or even in Central America, the Latin America has not regionally been a region of, historically been a region of refugees and migrants. And so it's really a very new practice. And I think many governments are just starting to get the hang of what a response to not only the pandemic, but refugee integration really is. So yeah, it's a very complicated time, and there's lots of needs to manage at this point.
It's so interesting. It leads me to precisely another question that I'm so curious about. So why did the situation change so quickly in Peru and Chile, considering that at the beginning it was kind of the political leaders were like touting the success and how they successfully managed it, and now Chile is not doing great at all. So what happened?
You know, it really comes down to inequality more than anything. I mean, that's the short answer, is inequality is the problem. But I think if we dig deeper into it, I'll take Peru first because I find it just a fascinating example where it had one of the strictest lockdowns in the region. The president was very proactive, implemented, you know, only certain days people could go out, and only essential things that they could do, like going to the market and going to doctor's offices and things like that. So it was sort of the model of what you would expect. You know, public health experts were very pleased with this. But then when we look at actually what happened and why the cases are rising, a lot of it comes down to the fact that, for example, around 40% of Peruvians don't even own a refrigerator. So it's a cultural practice to go to the market frequently, but it's also a necessity because they're not able to buy food for like a week-long period and keep it in their house. They have to go every single day to the market because the food will perish, for example, if they leave it in the house for too long because there's no refrigerator. So you have, you know, people are abiding by the lockdown in theory, but because they're only going out for that essential service that they need to do, but, you know, they have to do it daily. So then it kind of erodes the effectiveness of the lockdown. You also have very crowded living facilities. So this is true in many Latin American countries, and Peru is no exception, where even if you wanted to social distance, it's essentially impossible to do, because particularly in urban areas, and Lima has like 33% of all of Peru's population. So it's a very dense urban environment. And you have multiple people living in one household, and households very close together, very poor ventilation. Peru has like very high tuberculosis rates even in the region. So upper respiratory illnesses are already a problem. So you can imagine that even if you wanted to abide by certain rules, it's very impossible to do in a crowded living situation. And then of course, the other thing is that the access to healthcare is very different depending on where you live and how much money you make in the region. And that's the case really in Chile, where you have almost two Chiles. You have the wealthier society, who actually were the first people to get the virus and brought it to the country because they had been traveling abroad. And then that really actually spreads to the other Chile, or in Peru as well, and other countries, where it's really the informal workers, the lower class, the people who are poorer, who end up contracting it from the work that they do to service upper class society. And then, you know, unfortunately, as I mentioned, for all these other factors, it's much harder to receive treatment, and it's much harder to contain the virus in those populations. So really it comes down to the massive inequality. And then of course, if you add on top of that the situation for migrants and refugees who are even more marginalized because of their precarious status and because of the xenophobia, which is something I haven't mentioned, but we really have to talk about as well. You know, the sort of unease that many local populations have when a refugee or a migrant comes in. That's also something that can affect them. So it's complicated, but I think, yeah, what it really boils down to is that very few have a lot, and a lot have very little.
And I would like to compliment very quickly to the very comprehensive stuff that Rachel said, but just mentioning, like, in countries like Peru, with inequality so high, you also have very high levels of informality. For instance, like in Peru, informality levels reach over 70%. So you also have within that informality people who do not have the ability to take a day off. Mm-hmm. So basically it's survival, day-to-day jobs that, like, even if the lockdown is in place, they need to eat. You know, they need to work, because if they don't work, they don't earn a living. And if they don't earn a living, they don't eat. And if they don't eat, they don't, you know, like, it doesn't matter if a pandemic, they will still suffer. And I mean, this situation, we see it a lot with refugees, but we also have to consider that the pandemic is also affecting the most vulnerable lower tier of society that is often ignored, and that when we plan solutions to include refugees, we also need to include these host communities that are highly impacted as well by the pandemic and the lockdowns.
And one thing I'll just add, just to complement what Marta said, is that I think, particularly with refugees, but in general with the government response, it is important really to provide people the ability to stay home. And so if you're not providing cash-based initiatives or really any sort of supplement, even food aid or things like that, to ensure that people don't need to leave their homes, they're going to have to, as Marta said, because they have to eat. And unfortunately, many governments right now are not focusing on refugees in that aspect of providing sort of cash-based transfers or things like that. It's really humanitarian organizations that are doing that work, and they're very limited right now because of the pandemic. So it's just another thing to consider.
There's so many things that are happening at the same time in situations and countries that have already been burdened by not just inequality, but poverty and so many instabilities. You had mentioned markets, Rachel, and so it reminded me of a story that I read recently about Mexico, which and both, of course, Martha, please feel free to chip in. Mexico has recorded more than 30,000 deaths from its coronavirus outbreak. And I read recently a story how the tomato aisle at Mexico City's famed Central de Abasto market, quote, I quote, offers a glimpse into why the virus has hit the country so hard. Can you tell us a bit more about why this might have been the case? And then I read, it was very interesting for me to learn that nearly 3/4 of Mexico's coronavirus fatalities have involved underlying conditions such as hypertension or diabetes, from an article in Washington Post, to cite my source, because of cheap processed foods and sugary soft drinks, which have proliferated in recent decades, particularly in poor neighborhoods. Wow, with obesity and all the chronic diseases and illnesses which have multiplied.
Yeah.
So many layers of potential for this disaster to keep getting bigger. What's the situation with this market that I've been reading about, Rachel? And of course, Martha, please, if you're from Mexico, tell us more from what you're reading over there. You have family there as well. Rachel?
So I think the first thing to mention in the case of Mexico is actually, I'll talk about the market, absolutely, but I think the first thing to note is the president's response to the pandemic. And Mexico was one of the countries that, unlike Peru, was not quick to implement measures, and the government of Mexico, at least the president, has not been very encouraging in terms of setting a good example of, social distancing, wearing masks, really just general preparedness, and taking into account, public health experts' advice. So I think, you have leadership who's not being proactive with the pandemic. And then I think the other thing, which we've already mentioned a little bit, but the pandemic, what we found, and this is true even in the United States, right, that it's exacerbating problems that were already existing prior to the pandemic and has made them worse, and I would say compounded them with other new issues. So when you look at Mexico, as you mentioned, the high rates of diabetes and hypertension, this is affecting poorer populations, and that's true even in the United States, where we have Black and Latino people are disproportionately facing complications from the pandemic because of marginalization. I think it's similar in Mexico, where you have poorer people who have to go to the market to work every day because that's where they earn their money, and they don't have the luxury of staying home, and they're also consuming a diet that is cheaper and not as healthy, which means that they're not able to be as resilient from a virus perspective, from a health perspective. And so it's really decimating these populations that have to go to work every day, that also were poor before the pandemic and were consuming a diet that is less healthy because of their poverty. And then on top of that, you have a president and a government who's not been as proactive in the response as they could be. And I think that extends to like I said, cash responses or other types of responses that could aid people in being able to stay home. Those things are not being implemented. Martha, please compliment.
No, and I think I just want to echo what Rachel said and what we said before. And I think it also comes down to inequality again. And I think COVID is the disease and the pandemic that shows us that we need to do something about the high levels of inequality around the world. And Mexico is a case study for that. And you can see that, if people cannot take a day off their work, and if people have to go to the Central de Abastos or wherever it is that they need to go to work, they will need to go to work even if there's a pandemic or if it is burning outside. It doesn't matter because it's their survival. It's what they need to do to survive. And in countries with high levels of inequality, we will be increasingly seeing this, and obviously exacerbated by the fact that if government policies are not necessarily being effective, or if there is not necessarily, if the policies are in place but the implementation is not really rolling out or trickling down to the places where they need to be like that, then it's a problem. And also, I think it's important to talk about access to reliable information, because at the moment we have an astonishing amount of people that believe that the pandemic is a hoax, or it won't happen to me, or like, oh, I don't believe this, like I don't want to wear a mask. Like I don't know how many videos a day I see of individuals just fighting because they don't want to wear a face mask. And I think it's a matter as well to inform and avoid the spread of false information. Hello?
In Mexico, the debates about the mask?
Well, I see that around the world.
Oh,
I'm not necessarily like it happens in Mexico, but I've seen it here in the United States, and generally in a lot of places where the spread of misinformation around the pandemic is really high. And we need to make sure that the reliable information gets to these individuals as well. And I'm not saying that for some of them it's a choice and for so many it's not. So we need to tackle both, for those who cannot choose to whether go out or not, and those who can. So
it's so interesting that you mentioned conspiracy theories. I don't know, is it more depressing or more comforting to know that in that part of the world that I'm not too much familiar about, there are conspiracy theories happening as they're burgeoning in some parts of the world that I'm more familiar with. So it's both depressing and comforting, I guess. But I do want to ask Rachel, on June 9th, you and 3 of your colleagues wrote a very important article that was published in National Interest. The coronavirus has become terrorist combat weapon of choice. Can you tell us a little bit more, please, in terms of the relationship and the impact of coronavirus on those communities under, as you say, the sway of armed groups and non-state actors within the Latin American context? Because interestingly, for all listeners who are curious about this article encompasses also groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab in Africa, Hayat Tahrir, Sham in Syria as well, and then MS-13 and Barrio, gangs in El Salvador. So, Rachel, what is the situation in El Salvador or in Latin America in general? And can you please clarify to our listeners what I thought also was very interesting and important about what's different in terms of criminally motivated gangs that you say actually dominate pockets of land in this context, which we don't necessarily think about at first when we think about all these groups that I mentioned in general.
Sure, yes. So the case with El Salvador, and there are non-state actors in many other countries. I mean, cartels in Mexico is another perfect example of non-state actors or criminal armed groups that dominate areas. But in El Salvador in particular, it's a very interesting case because gangs are not, in other regions, you'll see a non-state actor or a criminal group sort of dominating one area of a country, let's say. In El Salvador, it's more municipalities or certain pockets of land. So if you look at a map of gang territory, you'll see it looks like little speckles almost. So really, these gangs are not necessarily dominated by mass control of huge swaths of population. They're really fighting at a very local level for turf and control of certain territory. And it's a very localized type of conflict that is different than if you look at something like cartels in Mexico, who are highly sophisticated. They really fit under that label of transnational criminal organizations. They have a lot of money and operate in large areas of the country. El Salvador is not that case, where there is money, but the majority of money that is being made by these criminal groups is through extortions. And so the biggest issue right now with the COVID pandemic is that these non-state actors and gangs, particularly in El Salvador, have dominated certain areas of the particularly in the cities. Let's take San Salvador, for example, have dominated certain areas of San Salvador where the state is not present. And so what they're doing is actually enforcing let's say social distancing or lockdown measures in the name of the pandemic, but really it's a way to exert more control. And what we see in the case of Mexico, for example, there's something that we call like narco philanthropy. And Martha, you've probably heard this term before, but it's not so much the case in El Salvador, but in places like Mexico, where you have the narco traffickers or the cartels actually providing services that the government is not, and they're able to exert control in that way. And that is actually the case in some areas, I know in the Middle East as well. My co-author wrote about that, where there's sort of an ideology or a sort of winning hearts and minds in some sense in certain areas. And so, or, you know, someone like Pablo Escobar in Colombia is a classic example of that sort of narco philanthropy. And so the pandemic is sort of creating conditions where these armed groups are able to exert more control and almost supersede or fill in the gaps that the state does not fulfill for people. So it's a tricky situation. I think the sad thing is in El Salvador is that the armed groups are not providing the things that really people need to survive this pandemic. And if anything, they're probably pushing people further into danger and harm, because not only are people having to fight, you know, deal with a virus that is killing people, but they're also having to deal with extreme violence from these actors who are dominating control of these areas and not allowing people to leave their homes not out of fear of the virus, but out of fear of being reprimanded or killed from these actors. So it's a really, really challenging situation. And unfortunately, El Salvador in particular has a very long history of these gangs kind of putting people in grave danger.
Yeah, and I mean, you partly addressed it now, and you wrote it in that article that this pandemic does require both coordinated and comprehensive efforts, but that ineffective responses will precisely and primarily be detrimental to civilians, as you mentioned. And then I was reminded that violent non-state actors are above international humanitarian law. So that makes it even more complicated, I guess, like you say, to for the civilians as well. So Rachel, relatedly, there was some information that the virus has kind of entered into some prisons in the three countries that are kind of composing the Northern Triangle, in Guatemala and in Honduras and in El Salvador. Why is that concerning?
It's concerning principally because of the overcrowding issue, where prisons in general are a hotbed for the spread of any sort of disease. Again, you cannot social distance in a prison. It's almost impossible unless governments were really emptying prisons and allowing people to do sort of alternatives to detention, like ankle monitors, et cetera. But in a lot of these countries, those programs don't even exist. And I think particularly in Central American countries, I'll talk specifically about El Salvador, there is a history of what we call mano dura, which is like a iron fist type of policies where violence is met with extreme punitive measures. So anyone is susceptible to being thrown into jail, particularly in a country where there is massive and widespread violence perpetuated by certain actors. So you have a very high prison population. El Salvador is the country with the second highest per capita prison population after the United States. And it's a country that's the size of, I think, Rhode Island. It's a tiny nation, but it has an enormous prison population. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing in this country is that the current president is sort of, not only are armed criminal groups sort of using the pandemic for tighter control, but we also see certain governments sort of taking advantage of the pandemic to become increasingly authoritarian. And so I think that is the case in El Salvador, where you see even stricter measures and putting more people in jail during a pandemic when that really shouldn't be happening right now. And unfortunately, that means not only an increased spread of the virus, but traditionally in these countries, when you have a very mano dura, iron fist policies, it actually increases the violence and increases homicide rates. So we're at sort of a lull right now, I think mostly because of people are not operating as normal under the pandemic. So the murder rate has decreased, but it will likely increase again. And so I think really what needs to be done is that governments have to start looking at alternatives to a mano dura, iron fist policy and really start figuring out other ways to reduce violence, reduce murder rates. And there are a lot of really interesting examples across the world on this in terms of how to get people out of gangs, how to reduce what we call recidivism, where someone leaves the gang and then it goes back into it. I mean, there's many programs that can be done, but they need real leadership to be implemented, and they need political support. And unfortunately, many of these countries, the political support really is more for the harder, stricter policies than it is for these sort of more holistic measures. So we have our work cut out for us, but the prison populations is definitely a huge cause for concern in these countries.
Wow, and when we speak about vulnerable populations, let's absolutely address the specific effects on displaced women and children. Even before the global health crisis, more than 70 million displaced people, at least half of them who are women and girls, were already struggling to get access to the most basic services. And Martha, please feel free to chip in with and to share your experiences. And you wrote actually about Martha Fernandez, a woman who has you know, in empowering other Venezuelan women in Peru. But also, Rachel, I want to ask you, how is the COVID-19 aggravating the dangers of human trafficking and exploitation of Venezuelan migrants in Mexico, but in general as well? And of course, the domestic violence. We have a Mexican president who has kind of dismissed as fake a lot of these domestic violence calls, which have increased dramatically.
As I mentioned earlier, you know, the pandemic again is exacerbating and making much worse pre-existing issues. And unfortunately, I think globally, but especially in Latin America, gender-based violence is a huge issue. We know that in Mexico, I think it was, I have the 4 times the number of calls reporting domestic abuse occurred in the first month of the pandemic. And so we see a really exponential increase in the number of violence against women cases that are occurring. And this is happening everywhere. I think, unfortunately, with particularly Venezuelan women, is that, you know, as I mentioned, they are already more vulnerable to, you know, not having those protection mechanisms and safety nets like a job or like a formal job and ability to stay at home safely. Many of these women have to go out and work, and many of the issues that women, many women who go out to work often work in jobs that could potentially be exploitative, particularly in the domestic sphere. Another issue that we faced in Colombia, but also in Peru and Ecuador, is the issue of evictions. So evictions in general are bad, right? You know, when you kick someone out of their home, they have nowhere to go. It leaves them incredibly vulnerable, but particularly for women, this is a huge issue where a trafficker or a sexual predator or someone who could cause great harm to this woman sees her as prey. Essentially, she is incredibly vulnerable when the woman is evicted or doesn't have, again, the safety nets that she requires to, you know, survive and thrive in a new country. I think another issue that we're facing in terms of the pandemic is something that you wouldn't think is a gender thing, but it is border closures. So for Venezuelans who typically want to cross into Colombia or Ecuador or Peru, for example, or even Brazil, there are the regular routes, which are the legal routes that are operated by the government. And then we have these things called trochas, especially in Colombia, that are the irregular routes. So these routes are operated typically by armed groups or by smugglers or other sort of criminal organizations. And so what we know even before the pandemic was that Venezuelan women who would try to enter through the trochas because they didn't have proper documentation to enter legally into the countries, like a passport or other types of things that they would need, they would go through the irregular route. And what the armed groups do is actually charge women sex to cross into a country. And so it's an incredibly exploitative industry. Many women are at risk of trafficking in border areas in particular. So the border closures are actually a huge issue right now that we have to focus on in terms of gender-based violence and trafficking of women and girls for sex trafficking. And then I think the last thing is just the, you know, the deviation of resources sort of away from providing support to women, even things like shelters that are closed right now during the pandemic, and using those resources for pandemic response is really leaving vulnerable women kind of out of the planning system. And so if a woman is trying to escape a domestic violence situation, particularly a a refugee or migrant woman and has no place to go, she's unfortunately forced to stay in that situation longer. And then, of course, in times of conflict, gender-based violence tends to be exacerbated because of strict gender roles. Often men are seen as the provider, and if they're not able to go out and work, it sort of increases tension within the home, and unfortunately women often bear the brunt of that conflict, of that tension. So those are just some of the things we're looking at in terms of gender-based violence during the pandemic. But Marta, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, no, I think that was great, Rachel. And I want to give a shout out to our colleague, Devon Kohn, who is the advocate for women and girls within Refugees International. And she published a fantastic report talking about all the consequence of COVID on displaced women and girls, which is on Refugees International website. But in general, like within our Lockdown and Left Behind report that we just published, we also find that in 4 out of the 7 countries that we research, women are also more likely to work in hard-hit sectors. And this is very important because women, when it comes to finding a job and integrating into the economy, they face a double disadvantage. The first one, because they're women, and they face the glass ceiling, lower income because just their female status, as we all do. And the second one, because they are displaced. So really, they're at the bottom of the chain when it comes to incomes, when it comes to vulnerabilities on just suffering from exploitation or abuse at their work, and also just like less self-reliance into be able to cover their expenses. And this increases when they have to take care of a child or they are the head of their household. And because of traditional gender roles, women also tend to have to be taking care of their child and then sometimes have to go to work. And this limits the possibility of jobs that they are able to take. And this is even before COVID. So all of this, and even if they're not displaced women, the lack of access to childcare really affects the jobs that women take. But for refugee women or displaced women, this vulnerability is even higher because they don't have access to the networks, like, you know, your family or your friend that will take care of your child, your cousin. So they end up often taking these informal jobs that allow them the flexibility, and they do end up in sometimes like even more suffering from exploitation and abuse. So in their situation just gets compounded when host countries pose restrictions for refugees to enter, which is something that we are increasingly seeing even before the pandemic in Latin America. And I'm sure Rachel can talk more about this. But as governments instate visas and just don't allow refugees to come in to their nation, especially in Latin American countries, refugee women or displaced women are taking these irregular routes, and in this way they can, as Rachel mentioned, they can suffer from exploitation, or sometimes like to cover their expenses they might take a job that you know, they might become sex workers. And first it is like, oh, I do it voluntarily, but it's definitely like in the long term, it's not voluntarily. So, and the story of Marta Fernandez is like, she's working with these women to make sure that they're able to avoid these situations and know their rights and protect themselves, but also find jobs and be able to integrate into the economy. And it was really impressive because it's women supporting women, which is something we need to see. And it's happening definitely around the world. And just a final thing, something that is really important in terms of gender-based violence is something that we definitely see at high rates. Like it was just a few months ago where the big manifestations of the Marea Verde in all of Latin America were happening to ask or demand for an end of gender-based violence, and specifically the high rates of murdering for women. And we need not to forget that refugee women are amongst those that also get murdered. And especially now with the lockdowns, many women, displaced or not, might be locked with their abuser. So it's important just to target this and make sure that within the funding and programming, we can take care of these very specific issues that women face.
Absolutely. And I do want to, now that you mentioned, we talked about domestic violence and vulnerabilities of women and children. One thing that has been particularly heartbreaking, and it's not related to Latin America, and I don't know, have you heard it, is that close to my country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, those working with refugees and migrants close to the Croatian border have become accustomed to basically seeing a lot of quite shocking scenes where people are frequently beaten and forced back across the border, stripped. They're having had their documents burned or having had dogs set on them. So there really have been reports of violence by Croatian police that continue kind of to almost go unchecked. So when we speak about all the vulnerabilities, so many of them are so same across the border, and then there are specificities in regions which are really heartbreaking in terms of the continual dehumanization that keeps on going around the world across geographic borders. There is so much more to talk about. I feel like we just scratched the surfaces of so many things, but they are so important, and I wanted to try to fit in as many of those most important trends or things that are happening in Latin America, through Rachel's expertise. And then Marta, you have even a broader scope in terms of the integration of expanding of economic rights of refugees in their host countries. So before we go to a more personal part of this podcast where I get to ask you a little bit about you, I was wondering if there is anything that you would like to add at the end, considering your work, or in terms of the future. Hope? Are you optimistic or negative? But you're working in Refugees International, so these are the kind of people who believe that there are good things could be better, I think. Rachel and then Marta, is there anything that you would like to add at the end?
Sure. I think the last thing that I just want to emphasize is the importance of the way we speak about refugees and the importance of telling stories and seeing that displaced people, refugees and migrants really are just like us. They have hopes and dreams and want to work and want to thrive in the communities that they find themselves in, and that they're leaving because of very dire circumstances. And so they're not victims, but they are unfortunately put in situations where they are in very difficult circumstances. And I think the more that we humanize them and the more governments are able to respond to them, the better that they will thrive in communities, and they no longer become victims of a circumstance, but really can become agents of change in the countries that they're in and really become part of the community and doing amazing things, like many of the stories that we've told at Refugees International. So I'm really glad to be having these conversations and speaking about these issues in a way that I think is, again, humanizing, and it isn't complex and nuanced, but it is something that I think we need more of these discussions. So thank you.
You're welcome. Martin, what would you like to share with our listeners?
First of all, echoing everything that Rachel said, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge the many contributions that refugees make to their host countries, either like if they are allowed to work as doctors, nurses, or even like just providing basic services in a time where no one wants to leave their home. And this happened even before the pandemic. And I really hope that COVID, if something can come out of COVID, is the fact that refugees are active contributors to their whole society, and expanding their access to jobs and their economic inclusion will allow them to fully fulfill this role and use their skills and knowledge to the benefits of their host communities. So I hope that after COVID, we can see further development, and especially now too, for host countries to allow refugees that are particularly skilled to contribute right now to the response of the pandemic, that they allow them to work and expand this access for them.
Absolutely. And I'll just end by saying that I was a refugee once, and I was a child, but my father was an engineer who was in lines for humanitarian aid for many months, and that he just wanted to work. And precisely to earn money with the skills that he has had to contribute to his family with dignity in circumstances that he did not ask for. So I don't talk about it much, but I absolutely, from my personal experiences, have a special heart for refugees and all those who, like you, to dedicate your professional work towards shedding light on this. So thank you for that as well. And I really urge all our listeners to keep following your work and amazing insights that you bring to the public. So I will link your handles and your social media information so that our listeners can also get more information if they want. But I'm not gonna let you go before I ask you some fun, light questions, because it's the pandemic and we do need to lighten up a little bit. So, okay, I'm gonna ask you something that I called 5 sweet questions. I'll ask and then both of you can respond. And it's really funny how some people give me super serious answers and I, of course, and some people give the right answers. So you can just, as you understand it. Okay, so the first question, once the current emergency is over, whatever that end up meaning in according to one's worldview, I guess, or geographic circumstance, any temporary awareness will also disappear. But what would you not want to forget from this pandemic period? Is there anything?
Rachel?
I think for me, the biggest thing is the importance of actually slowing down. I think that the way that I personally am, and I think that the work that Marta and I do, there is a sort of sense of urgency, and we're really, really passionate about the work we do. But I think it's nice to have been able to sort of be at home and take the time to rest and enjoy time with family and those things. And so I don't want to forget the feeling of having time and taking time for myself. I think it's that term self-care, it is very important, and it's not something that I'm very good at. So I think this time has actually given me more of an opportunity to work on that, and I hope that stays after the pandemic.
Marta?
Well, I mean, maybe this is a little sadder, but for me, it's my freedom to just take a flight and go see my family. Like, with the pandemic, and obviously my family in Mexico, so with the pandemic, we are just avoiding to leave, and avoiding to leave our houses, avoiding public spaces. And, especially when you're international and you have your family in like X country abroad, like just the ability to just take a flight at any time and be like, yeah, mom, I'll be there. Like, and just that, and just really appreciating that freedom, and also acknowledging the privilege that it is to have that freedom is something that I will be more grateful now every time I take a flight.
Absolutely. My in-laws were supposed to come on April 6th, and they were so excited to see their grandkids, and it just fell apart, and they couldn't come from Turkey. And it's precisely that. My heart breaks when these grandparents wait so long to get grandkids, and now they can't see them. So here's to vaccine, hoping that the scientists do their best, because we can get herd immunity from what I read from Spanish outlets. So next question, which of your personality traits has been the most useful? Not the best, but most useful. Rachel, go.
I think one of my personality traits is being slightly neurotic. I think that has not been a great personality trait, but it has been useful in the sense that I definitely have a lot of energy and ability to work a lot and still have energy to spare. So I think that that's definitely a personality trait that has served me well, that of course, again, with self-care needs to be done in moderation, but I do think that my high energy and slightly that neuroses I have of work has been good for me overall.
Very good self-inspection right there, Rachel. You?
Well, as my mom would put it, hablo hasta por los codos, which will translate like I speak a lot. So I talk a lot and I never shut up. So I think, and especially like now working in so important issues, like this ability to just speak a lot and speak out when I want to or I believe in something, it's very important, especially because I can raise the voice of those who are currently not really heard, and I appreciate that.
I'm so grateful that you're here today. I found the right person for this to precisely to share the work that you're so passionate about. So next question. When you have 30 minutes of free time that you can control, like under control, how do you pass it? Rachel.
I've been doing a lot more reading lately and reading for fun, which has been nice. I think I've been reading just fantasy and fiction and things that sort of bring me joy. So if I've got like a spare 30 minutes, I've been doing a lot more reading lately. The other thing that I'll do, which I haven't been doing as much because of the pandemic, is dancing, which I dance a lot of salsa. My mother was a dancer as well. So I think those are sort of the two things that I'll try and squeeze in.
You don't dance with the mirror? Like, you know, there's some funny clips of people dancing.
Yeah, I'm teaching my partner, actually. He's never danced before, so he's learning salsa now. So we're doing salsa and Spanish lessons.
That's awesome. Martha, you?
Something that I'm doing now a lot that I actually never did before is taking a lot of long walks outside. Like by myself, just like an hour or half an hour. And I just like really I had the opportunity to be in an area where it's not very crowded and it's kind of like in nature. So reconnecting with nature or going hiking on the weekends and just really enjoying nature. And that's something that I didn't know I had in me. So that's really nice. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think that I always joke with my husband, I lived in cement and the cities, but now I realize the beauty and of the woods and the nature, as you say as well, in terms of just breathing and connecting in a way that we don't, because we're always so busy and we have to do this and that, really appreciating the nature, as you say. And science has shown through decades of research the benefits of nature for us as well. So absolutely, I urge everybody to go out there and do a walk. It's healthy for you, and psychologically and physically as well. So what skill or craft would you like to master, Rachel?
I like to cook a lot, but I would like to master, it sounds silly, but like knife skills and like learning how to chop better. And like, I don't know, I've been doing a lot of like classes online on like how to better my cooking skills, because it's something I really enjoy doing, but I've never had any like training in it, you know, just learn from like watching my mom do that and my dad even. So
right here, connecting, chopping, and you're the first person, but chopping is good, you know, like they chop like quickly the onions when they do it.
Exactly.
So it's a skill. It's a skill.
It is a skill. That's a silly one, but it is something I would like to.
There's nothing.
It's really cool.
Pandemic. Martha, you.
So my guilty pleasure is sing. I really enjoy singing. I'm not saying I do it well, but I really enjoy doing it for myself. It really relaxes me. If I had a bad day, I'll just pop Whitney Houston and yell it at, you know, of my lungs, like not well, but still do it. Like it relaxes me so much. So I decided to buy a ukulele. So now I am able to do something with a ukulele. So that's been new for me.
Wow, that's awesome. I would like to ask you to sing something for us, but
no.
Next time when you perfect the ukulele, let's have like another Zoom that's to kind of see what's going on. So, okay, next question, last one. Are any of your friends completely opposite to you, or are most of them similar to you? Rachel.
So I did the Peace Corps, and most of my friends are Peace Corps volunteers. So I think in some sense we are all very like idealists and like highly motivated and care about the world. So I think in many sense we're very similar. I think there's some differences that are good, and we've had some really great conversations in the last few weeks about like how we're managing being at home, how we're managing like, you know, being at home with another person, whether it's a roommate or a partner or things like that. So I think I've always surrounded myself with people who sort of push me when I need to be pushed, but also I think share my like core values. So I think that's the most important thing, is that we know when we need to push each other and also how to support each other the best that we can. So yeah.
And you, Martha, what about your friends?
Well, I come from a very small town in Mexico, and not a lot of people get involved in these issues or leave to other cities or countries. So, I mean, it's really a breath of fresh air to go back home and talk about other things like, oh, you have a business, or I have children, or I have a farm, or I work in a farm. Like all these things that is very different from the life in DC or in America, or like people even working with refugees. And I have also the opportunity to meet people who are migrants themselves, or just from a very different background and very different social status and living as well. And I just feel so grateful to have this plethora of friends that just provide so much to my life and such a broad view of how they see life and their own experiences. And I think that's just, I'm very thankful to come from like just very far away, although I miss my home sometimes.
You said it so beautifully, Martha. So I'm very grateful that you two found time to be with me here today. I've had a really illuminating 1 hour and a half almost, and I wish that things were different, and I wish that we didn't have to talk so much about an increasing shift, basically, as we said at the beginning, in terms of comparison of how things were in 2010, 2015 now, in terms of the number of displaced people. But I am heartened by the fact that there are people like you, and that we get to connect, and that we get to share our work and our active dedication towards bringing the good stories, even when they're bad stories, and different recommendations. So thank you so much for being here at Dignified Resilience. I wish you all the best. Anything else quickly before we wrap it up that you would like to say to our listeners? 1, 2, 3. Anyone?
Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for listening, and be kind and patient, and we'll get through this, and just don't leave refugees behind.
And take care of yourselves, most importantly. Yes.
Absolutely. I always say, stay well and hold tight to those you love. So, and stay tuned for more conversations with people from all around the globe.